Christopher Nolan's Tenet is undoubtedly one of the most story-wise debated upon movies of last year, although the opinions about it were quite conflicting. Some among critics and audiences praised its originality and freshness, while others lamented aspects like its overwhelming complexity or the coolness of its tone. All of these impressions were equally rooted in storytelling choices made in the screenplay, which will be the object of this analysis. The aim of this video essay is not, however, that of offering a personal review of the movie. Instead, I want to inspect what I consider the distinctive features of its screenplay in an attempt to better understand how the whole story works and how it manages to keep us entertained and engaged for almost 2.5 hours. I'll be arguing that the script carefully selects elements of the classical story design, but also deliberately breaks some screenwriting golden rules. On one hand, in fact, Nolan experiments within the principles of a traditionally well-built screenplay, but on the other, he also goes beyond some limits and tries to conceive alternative strategies to trigger the attention of the audience. Before getting to what I deem to be the most disruptive feature of the screenplay, I want to briefly stress the ways in which the script moves inside, even if rather close to the edges of the classical story design. On this level, Tenet works because it isn't completely experimental, but rather an equilibrium of familiar and unfamiliar. Tenet appears to be something between a classical plot and a more experimental one. I think it can be placed halfway between what Robert McKee defines as an arc plot and what Jeff Rush and Ken Danziger call experimental narrative. The arc plot is a story built around an active protagonist who struggles against primarily external forces of antagonism to pursue his or her desire through continuous time within a consistent and closely connected fictional reality to a closed ending of absolute irreversible change. Tenet fits this paradigm for what concerns the external forces of antagonism and the closed ending, but some doubts can be cast on the activeness of a protagonist who is pretty much obeying orders, or on the continuity and consistency of a story word that might appear, at least at a first watch, quite confusing. As a matter of fact, the story also presents features proper to the experimental narrative, which is a voice-oriented genre in which the style overwhelms the content, characters remain stereotypes, structure tends to be non-linear, and the tone is important and tends to add to our involvement in the film. Again, the movie has some of these traits, but not all of them. Tenet lets the recognizable voice of its author shine through, and has a protagonist who is anything but a full-blown character. In contrast, its story is told in a linear way and its use of tone is not remarkable. Tapping into both of these narrative forms, the movie fulfills certain audience expectations but also teases its spectators in new ways. I think that this equilibrium of tradition and innovation is particularly evident in 3 aspects of the screenplay. First of all, Tenet follows the 3-act restorative structure. In the first act, stretching from the beginning up to the first encounter with Priya, the story is set up. The protagonist is given the objective of saving the world, learns something about what power he has to confront, and has a name for his enemy. The second, being about confrontation, i.e. about the protagonist encountering obstacles that prevent him from achieving his goal, goes from the following meeting with Michael Crosby up to the protagonist's announcement that he has a plan to prevent Sator's algorithm from being activated in the future. The third act, regarding the resolution, shows the protagonist's plan in action on the 2 fronts of Vietnam and Stocks 12, eventually leading him to the defeat of Sator. The only minimal alteration of this structure lies in the second act, which is rather long for the standards. Usually, in the average screenplay, it occupies about 60 pages or 60 minutes, while in Tenet it lasts an hour and a half. As a consequence, the already arduous challenge of keeping the audience engaged in the story during the act depends even more in Tenet's case. The movie, however, remedies the problem by articulating the action into what can be identified as 3 distinct narrative arcs, each of which has its own structure. The first lays the protagonist in direct contact with Sator, the second revolves around the collaboration between the two, aimed at the theft of the plutonium-241, and the third one features the inverted protagonist saving Kat and trying to vainly reacquire the plutonium. Another point of intersection between classical and experimental storytelling involves the use of genres. Deprived of all the inverse entropy technology, Tenet is a basic spy story. The main character is a secret agent on a mission who pretends to be an international jet-set personality interested in arms dealing in order to infiltrate into the business of an important oligarch and counteract his evil plans, while also counting on the help of his unfaithful wife. Tenet's novelty is mixing the basic plot tropes of this genre with sci-fi elements, which moderately alter some of its features. The threat of future artifacts able to reverse the entropy of the entire planet raises the stakes of the usual spy story, while the presence of devices allowing characters to move backwards in time makes the plot comprehension more challenging. Anyways, the spy genre remains the main anchor to which the spectator can cling to orientate in the movie, providing a set of expectations that are constantly met, above all in the final triumph of the main character over the villain. A third element that I think well represents the equilibrium of traditional and disrupted features is embodied in the treatment of time. Despite being set in a world in which, thanks to specific technologies, characters can run across the timeline in both directions, forward and backwards, the movie allows anyways the spectator to experience time in a progressive and linear way. We are, in fact, following the protagonist in almost every step, using him as a frame of reference that he's always going forward. While these three mentioned aspects can be examples of how Tenet's screenplay doesn't position itself too far from a classical one, another aspect directly contrasts with screenwriting good practices, the relationship between the protagonist and the film structure. According to Robert McKee, a well-told story demands a substantial interlock of character and structure. As he states, all stories are character-driven, event design and character design mirror each other. Thus, according to the author, every turning point of the story should also mark a crucial step in the development of the character. In contrast with this principle, Nolan concedes the main character openly presented as one-dimensional. He doesn't have a name or a sharp identity, he's just the protagonist, a mere narrative function lacking the depth of a well-rounded character, and this is obvious from the beginning. The first act, as we have seen, successfully sets up the situation and the dramatic premise, i.e. what the story is about, but does nothing to explore what the protagonist is like as a person. We don't know what he desires, what he fears, what his background, and thus we're denied the possibility to create with him an emotional bond that might spur identification. The only thing we learn about him is that he's a CIA agent, and as proven by the passing of the initial test, a very loyal one. Moreover, the protagonist doesn't evolve throughout the movie. Maybe a slight change is noticeable in his relationship with Kath, whom he initially sees just as a means to get to her husband Sator, but of whose safety he becomes more and more concerned towards the end. If he initially lies to her about the Goya painting that keeps her a hostage of Sator being destructed, later he gives her a gun for protection, does his best to save her when she gets shot, gives her a phone to seek help from posterity, and in the end he also rejects Pierre's resolution to kill her. But his minimal shifts take up just a secondary and rather unexplored storyline, which remains confined as more gestures or allusions, and doesn't get to a closed ending. Otherwise, for what concerns the main action, the protagonist appears just like a pawn at the mercy of the plot, and in this sense the movie takes high concept to the extreme, focusing much more on action than on the development of the character. However, at a closer look, stating that the protagonist does not have a role in shaping the structure of the movie seems reductive. And I'm not stating this referring to the fact that how we learn towards the end the plot is all a protagonist's creation, but rather on how it still is experience that keeps us glued to the screen. The protagonist, despite the lack of characterization, plays a crucial role in engaging the audience in the movie, but the kind of bond we develop with him doesn't have an emotional foundation, but rather a cognitive one. While watching the film, we can relate to the emotions of a main character we know so little about, but we're always alarmed with his knowledge of the world surrounding him. We experience the narration mainly through his point of view, so our knowledge of the menace he's facing constantly coincides with his, and we're pushed through the narrative seeking for his same answers. There are of course some scenes in which the protagonist is not present, but they don't give us any advantage over him. The movie takes in fact some time to explore the relationship between Kate and Sator, but those moments, given how the arms dealer keeps his wife outside of his business, don't provide any information about the nature of the man's plans.
You have no idea what I'm talking about, do you?
But it's
sounds terribly important.
While immersed in the movie, we don't just want to see if the protagonist will defeat the enemy or not. We are also curious to explore the dynamics of the narrative world Nolan has built, and to discover why Sator wants to destroy the world and how exactly he intends to do it. And this desire for answers arises since we're presented with the inciting incident, the event that puts the story in motion, that coincides with the protagonist being recruited to save the world against a mysterious menace. According to Robert McKee, when the audience experiences an inciting incident, the film's major dramatic question, a variation on how will this turn out, is provoked to mind. In Tenet, this question can be identified with the cliched "will the protagonist save the world?" But I think that along with it, because of the recruiter's vagueness while explaining the mission to the protagonist, in the mind of the spectator arises a second one: what's the nature of the threat? Obviously, this latter question is subordinate to the first, because the protagonist's chances of saving the world are also linked to his ability to identify what menace he has to neutralize. It remains, however, a question whose energy flows through most of the movie, up to when it receives an answer at the end of the second act. Until that point, the tension is not built up only by the questions of life and death involving the protagonist, but also by the path he undergoes to understand what might cause World War III. A path studded with a lot of questions and clarifications that are always partial.
It's hard to take things on trust from people speaking half-truths.
The plot alternates events raising questions and acquisitions of new knowledge. The first sequence after the protagonist's recruitment showed this very mechanism at work, with a presentation of a strange phenomenon followed by an explanation of its functioning, which ends up arousing new questions. We see inverted bullets for the first time.
Symptom.
Aim it.
The protagonist tries to familiarize with them, but he's still puzzled, so the scientist studying them gives him more information.
It's inverted. Its entropy runs backwards, so to our eyes its movement is reversed. We think it's a type of inverse radiation triggered by nuclear fission.
And this new knowledge makes him wondering who's producing the weapons.
Do you have an analysis on the metals?
Sure. Why?
The mixture alloys can tell me where they might have been made.
His research leads him to Mumbai, where he finally gets to know who's behind the dealing of inverted arms.
The dealer you're looking for sounds resetter.
But again, this explanation arises new questions about what's the role of the future in the plan.
He can communicate with the future.
We all do.
Don't we? Emails, credit cards, texts, anything that goes into the record speaks directly to the future.
The question is, can the future speak back?
A similar pattern follows the appearance of the inverted man from a portal at Oslo Freeport, which brings the protagonist back to Priya for an explanation.
I'm going back to Mumbai to get some answers.
The woman tells him that the piece of technology he saw was a turnstile, able to invert people. But again, this answer brings other questions to light.
Turnstile.
A machine for inverting.
You told me that technology hasn't been invented yet.
It hasn't. He's been given it by the future.
For what?
You have the best chance of finding out.
As we pass the midpoint of the movie, the stakes have risen, and a lot of other questions regarding the nature of the threat pile up one after the other. What's really the object Sator wanted to steal?
I've seen symbols of encapsulation in every weapons class. This is not one of them.
Why didn't Sator get the plutonium-241?
If you're not telling the truth, she dies.
I don't know what you're talking about.
And who are the people Neil called to get help?
This is Ives. He's one of us.
Us? Who are these guys?
These questions gradually find their answers, but in reverse order. Ives explained that he and his troop are on their side, and that they're performing a temporal pincer movement. While the inverted protagonist is attempting to seize again the plutonium-241, we get more clues on the route he made. And finally, Neil tells the protagonist that Sator is trying to assemble the algorithm and what would be the consequences of that action.
Everyone and everything that's ever lived, destroyed instantly.
The following scenes slot the final pieces of the puzzle into place. Back to Oslo Freeport, the protagonist understands that the inverted man he had previously met on foot was actually himself. Later, Priya tells the protagonist the story of the algorithm, built in the future by a scientist, who then decided to divide it and hide it in the past. And finally, at the end of the act, we also get why Sator wants to end the world.
inoperable pancreatic cancer.
And he's taking the world with him.
The described path, gradually leading the protagonist to the discovery of Sato's intentions, thus plays a crucial role in keeping the audience cognitively aligned with the main character, hooked to the story. And in this sense, it could be said that there's still a strong connection between the main character and structure, even if plot points do not coincide with big changes in the protagonist's character, but rather with significant acquisition of knowledge regarding the story world. In conclusion, the movie's screenplay is a great example of balance of classical and innovative storytelling. While we go through the movie, we get the feeling that the narrative might surprise us anytime, but we are also guided by the tenet that all questions will find an answer and that the protagonist will eventually win.
Which is an expression of faith in the mechanics of the world.